appreciate it. And this is as my rookie debut. I want to warn you, there might be some dad jokes in here, some 90s references and things. And I appreciate it if you laugh, even if it's not funny. So okay, so first let me introduce myself. My name is Jason Byrne. I'm a native Floridian. I was born in a small town called Sebring, Florida, a couple hours south of here that some of you guys may have heard of. Somebody I've already heard of tonight who's from Sebring, so that's pretty awesome. I moved to Seminole County in 2002, and today I live in Winter Springs with my wife, Melinda, my daughter, Angela, who are here in the front row, and our two Boston Terriers, Kermit and Luna. By day, I work for a company called Flow Sports, and we stream sports media online. But at night, the thing is, I have a confession to make. For a few years now, I've been living a double life, and it's been eating me up inside, and I just need to get it off my chest. By day, I'm a mild-mannered software engineer, but at night, I become history man. Okay? So it's taken over my life, and it's this big obsession, and some of you already have been familiar with my work, but despite my daily profession, my career of choice, I've long had a passion for history and for writing. And for that reason, when I was at Florida Southern College in Lakeland, I majored in journalism and I minored in history. So I've always had this, something that I wanted to do with my life, and now I do. And I blame my wife for this latest obsession because she told me I needed to get a hobby, and I did, and now it's completely taken over my life, but it is what it is. So I like to write stories about Central Florida history. Sometimes I write stories about social justice. It's also a passion of mine. And sometimes I write stories that are about a little bit of both. And maybe some of you guys are familiar with my work. If not, please check them out at floridahistoryblog.com. My Facebook page is facebook.com/JasonByrneHistory. And many of you know the Seminole County Florida History group on Facebook. So check those out. Well, without further ado, let's dive into the feature presentation tonight, and that is Making a County. This is the story of the founding of Seminole County in 1913, and its bitter divorce from Orange County. And that separation between the two counties really was very bitter, which is crazy now to think about because today we're all such good friends and partners. Maybe you work in Seminole County and you live in Orange County or vice versa. And even looking at the map, the counties look really familiar, really friendly, right? I mean, Orange County's like reaching up around Seminole County, giving it a little hug, and Seminole County's nuzzled in there. It looks like they fit together, but it wasn't always like that. And in fact, 100 years ago, the relationship between Sanford and Orlando was quite the opposite. And it really bordered on hatred, and that's not much of an overstatement. But to understand the root of all that hatred, you have to go back to the beginning. Why was there this rivalry? Well, the beginning of it started in 1821. So let's start there. 1821 was the year that Florida joined the United States as a territory. It was previously part of Spain, as you know, and was ceded by a treaty in 1821. At that time, there was only 2 counties in the entire state of Florida. And they were roughly equivalent with West and East Florida, which were the old Spanish provinces. But when they became a territory, they became Escambia County in the west and St. Johns County in the east. Of course, we're in St. Johns County. The 2 counties were separated in the middle by the Suwannee River. At that time, there was hardly anybody who lived in this part of the state, except for Seminole Indians and runaway slaves and things of that nature. All of the population center was pretty much to the north of Gainesville, which is roughly that yellow line there. So in 1824, they realized that a county that was made up of the entire peninsula of Florida was entirely too much for one county seat to manage, so they split up St. Johns County into a number of other counties, including Mosquito County. Not the best name, but that was the name of the county that we are in right now. So that was formed in 1824. So you see, Mosquito County was massive. It stretched all the way from Palm Coast in Flagler County down to Palm Beach. So it was still a very big county, but the thing is, only a few hundred people lived there, so it was okay. The year before that, there was something else interesting that happened, and that was the Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823. And what the Treaty of Moultrie Creek did was, it was an agreement between the Seminole tribe and the U.S. government. And so what they did, what the U.S. government agreed to do, is carve out a reservation for the Seminoles in the middle of the state. They were very careful not to give them any coastline, but they gave them a large territory that stretched all the way from Ocala down to Lake Okeechobee, which at first it seems like that was pretty generous of the federal government to do, right? I mean, that's a big territory to give the Seminoles, unless you consider the fact that they used to have the entire state, which we took from them. So I guess it's all about your perspective on things. But regardless, they had this territory which was right up against our borders, and in fact was part of Western Seminole County was in that Seminole territory. But even so, the Seminoles roamed freely all through this land. They didn't have, technically their borders were well away from the St. Johns River, but they went to the St. Johns and they used it as a highway to go north and south. They followed game. This was their territory. There was no border guards back then, no border crossings. It was quite porous. There was no border wall. I mean, the Seminoles may have paid for it if we would ask nicely, but I'm guessing probably not, right? But regardless, the boundaries changed frequently, and Seminole County comes by its name for good reason, because this was the Seminoles territory. Consequently, no white settlers lived in this area at that time. In fact, in 1830, only 15 households and 733 people lived in all of Mosquito County. Remember how big that was from the map earlier. Later that year in 1830, something else happened, and that was Andrew Jackson was elected president, which was seen as problematic for the Seminoles, because if you remember, Jackson led the first Seminole War. He was the general who led the incursion against the Seminoles. So they weren't too happy when he took office, and he proved them right, because soon thereafter he passed the Indian Removal Act, which basically says to the Seminoles, hey guys, remember that treaty that we signed with you like 7 years ago? We gave you this reservation. We're not really feeling that anymore, so we're gonna take that back, and you have 5 years to go to Oklahoma. So that was what they were facing, and most of the chiefs of the Seminoles agreed. They knew the writing was on the wall. They knew what was going to happen if they didn't go. So most of them packed up and left town and went to Oklahoma, but some of them resisted. Remember back then, the Seminoles weren't a single tribe. They were really a bunch of smaller tribes, right? So a lot of them resisted, including the war leader Osceola, who's famous. And that was the beginning of the Second Seminole War. As a result of the Second Seminole War, the U.S. government put forts down the middle of the state, including 3 forts through our 3 counties. And there was the primary forts. There were other forts, but these were the primary ones. It was Fort Mellon near Sanford, Fort Maitland, and then Fort Gatlin to the south of Orlando. So that was the first real movement into this area by white settlers. Granted, they were military. But as a result of that war, that 733 people we talked about 10 years ago in 1830 dwindled down to 73 people in Mosquito County in the 1840 census. So everybody left. The attacks by the Seminoles were very frequent. But 2 years later, the Seminoles had been significantly beaten back, and they were mainly constrained down to the territory between Naples and Lake Okeechobee. And their numbers were down. And we think of the Seminoles today as an Everglades people, like the swamp dwelling people, but that they really weren't. They were really from Georgia and North Florida, and they just became swamp dwellers out of necessity because we pushed them back until they had no other place to go. But regardless, in 1842, the U.S. government was beaten down, the Seminoles were beaten down. The U.S. government had spent more money on the Second Seminole War than they did the American Revolution, so everybody was done fighting. So both sides just kind of gave up without any kind of treaty. And that was the beginning of the true settlers here in Seminole County. In 1842, the Armed Occupation Act accelerated that growth because it basically gave you free land. So what you had to do is come in, set up a homestead, defend that homestead for 5 years, and you get 160 acres for free. It was a great deal. And there's plenty of land to be had in the newly opened territory where we live today. So in 1843, the county seat was Enterprise, which is just across Lake Monroe from us near Deltona. But that didn't last very long because quickly Mellonville, which is the precursor of Sanford, started to take precedence, and it became the commercial center of this area. And so it became the county seat in 1845, and that growth was accelerated by the fact that they set up a ferry that crossed Lake Monroe, which made access to this interior region a lot easier. So Mellonville had leftover barracks and things from the old fort. So they had 8 two-story buildings that became some of the first trading posts and households, and then they had the old fortress itself. And a nice little town started to develop around Melonville. You can see where Melonville is on the map in yellow. It's just a mile to the east of downtown Sanford today, and there's Fort Mellon Park there if you want to go visit the old site of Melonville. And then 2 miles south of that is Fort Reed, which is on Melonville Road. And Fort Reed was the second town to develop. And it became kind of the commercial center, where Melonville became kind of the transport center. So everybody came by steamboat to Melonville and then headed down the road to Fort Reed. So in 1845, Melonville was now the county seat, and Florida became a state. It became the 27th state in the Union. Other notable things happened that year: they shaved Mosquito County in half and formed St. Lucia County on the south. And also, finally, and thank goodness, they renamed Mosquito County to the much more tourist-friendly name, Orange County. And thank goodness they did, because I don't think Disney would have put his theme parks here. So what about Orlando? We've talked all this time about Melonville, about all these things, and we haven't yet mentioned Orlando, and that's because Orlando didn't exist. It wasn't even a figment of anybody's imagination at this point. What we had is we had a region that was generally known as Fort Gatlin, which was the southern half of the county. Fort Gatlin was on this little peninsula, as you see in yellow, on Lake Conway, and the people who lived in the vicinity of Fort Gatlin just kind of called it Fort Gatlin. But there was no town. There was nothing really but settlers who happened to live within a few square miles of each other. In 1843, a settler by the name of Aaron Jernigan came in, and in old maps you might see the town of Jernigan in the 1850s. That's because Aaron Jernigan petitioned for a post office and got a post office in 1850, but that post office was just out of his home where he had a trading post. There was absolutely no town. So despite it being on the map, there was no town. Where Orlando is today is a bit to the north between Lake Eola and Lake Lucerne, about 6 miles north, but there was absolutely nobody that lived there. Again, there was just kind of scattered settlers throughout the entire area. So in 1856, we have the first battle between Sanford and Orlando. Neither Sanford or Orlando existed by name at this point in time, but regardless, between the two regions of settlers, this was the match. And the match was between two cousins. It was spearheaded by Judge James Spear and Dr. Algernon Spear. So Judge James Spear, he was a recent settler at that time in 1856. He had moved to Fort Gatlin in 1854, and he was a judge and an attorney. And he came in at a very, very good time for him, because about the time that he was coming in, Aaron Jernigan was going out. Aaron Jernigan was the leader of the community, but he was brought up on murder charges and all kinds of craziness, which would be a whole other presentation. But he left town, and Judge Spear came in, and he filled that vacuum and became the town leader. To the north, his cousin was Dr. Algernon Spear. This is an actual picture of him. No, this is actually Dr. House. There's no picture of Dr. Spear, so we're going to have to House agree to stand in for him. But he came in 1843, and he moved to the area of Fort Reed. And he planted the first citrus groves in the county, which is a huge deal, obviously. And he carried a lot of wealth and political clout with him, especially because he married into the family of the founder of Jacksonville. So he was kind of a big deal. Not really him. So what we had in 1856 was a three-way battle. There was another town to the west called the Lodge, and the Lodge was actually now known as Apopka. There was a small community that developed around the Masonic Lodge there, and it was called the Lodge, and that movement for the county seat to be there was led by Isaac Newton, not Sir Isaac Newton, but Isaac Newton nonetheless. And we've already talked about Judge Spear in the south and Algernon Spear, Dr. Spear in the north. So, as a child of the 90s, when I thought about these battles between Sanford and Orlando, I was like, round one, fight. And this is Mortal Kombat. If you didn't grow up in the 90s, I apologize. This is what I pictured in my head. So we've got Dr. Spear and Judge Spear going at each other. Boom, right? So here's the deal. This was not even a good match. Dr. House was going to just destroy him. It was sealed. The fate was done, because Fort Reed had far more population. They were already the county seat. They had the commercialization. They had the transport. Remember, there was no railroads back then, right? So how could you get to Orlando? We had to ride into Sanford on a steamboat, and you had to take a full day ride down sandy trails to get to Orlando. why in the world would it make any sense for that region of the county to be the county seat? It didn't. And besides that, it was a vote. It was a popular vote. So Fort Reed was going to win just by nature of having more people, right? Well, nope. Judge Spear in Fort Gatlin pulled it out. How in the world could a non-town with less population beat the existing town? Well, Florida has had their share of shady elections, and this was maybe the first. So what Judge Spear realized, being an attorney, is that he knew the law very well, and soldiers were permitted to vote wherever they happened to be on election day, okay? Now, Fort Gatlin itself was decommissioned in 1849, so there was no soldiers at Fort Gatlin, but there were soldiers in other parts of the state. So Judge Spear said, I know what to do. He threw a party. He invited all these soldiers to come in from other regions. He threw this big banquet and said, hey, while you're here, why don't you cast your ballot for Fort Gatlin? And that's what they did, and that's how Orlando stole the county seat from Sanford area for the first time. So you can imagine the bitterness that welled up around that, but there was also a question that welled up as a result. There was no town of Orlando, there was no town of Fort Gatlin, there was no town of Jernigan. Where were they going to put the county seat? Where were they going to put the courthouse? They needed a town. It just so happened conveniently that Judge Spear also owned some land on the banks of Lake Eola. And so there was a trail that led from Mellonville to Fort Gatlin that also passed by that same spot. And so Judge Spear said, hey, why don't we put it here and I'll donate the land for the courthouse. So that's what they did. And this is what Orlando looked like shortly thereafter, a couple of years later, when they had just the beginnings of a town. You see on the bottom here, this first courthouse here, it was the only existing building in the area. It was just a single room log cabin, and that was the first courthouse. And then soon thereafter, they built the second courthouse, which was basically like a three-frame wood room. And that was all there was to Orlando. Not very much, not a very impressive county seat. And by the way, Lake Lucindy here now is known as Lake Lucerne, just so you have a little bit of context of where you're looking at. And this is, it's maybe not literally, but roughly like Roseland, if you know downtown Orlando. And this, of course, Mellonville Trail led up to Mellonville. So that was all there was to Orlando. And again, it didn't exist until the fact that they got the county seat. A year later is when it actually got its name, Orlando, which is a controversy in itself that we won't get into, but it was named by Judge Spear in 1857 as Orlando. So in the years after that, remember we're getting to the 1860s, so if you know your history, you know that was a civil war. And following the Civil War, there was the Reconstruction, and that was really rough on the economy of this area. So not a whole lot happened over the next decade or so, except for the fact that we actually go back a slide here, except for the fact that that courthouse that we just talked about, well, I can't go back, there we go. The courthouse was burned down in 1868, which was a disaster from a historian's perspective because we lost so many vital pieces of the early county history when that fire happened. But other than that, not much happened until 1870. In 1870 is when Henry Sanford arrived in town. And so obviously Henry Sanford is the namesake of the town of Sanford. And he was a big deal. He was famous, he was wealthy, he was everything. He spoke with a European accent, he had spent so much time abroad. He had millions of dollars, he always dressed poshly to the nines. He spoke very eloquently, he was very much an outsider, but his money was very much needed. He was appointed as by Abraham Lincoln as the U.S. Foreign Minister to Belgium. So he was famous. And he invested in a lot of territory in the state of Florida and finally really fell in love with the Lake Monroe area, about 23 square miles to the west of Mellonville on Lake Monroe. A lot of land. And he brought in some immigrants, and he invested in orange groves and all kinds of other things. But nobody thought very much about it at first. They didn't realize his full ambition. They thought maybe he'd invest money in Mellonville, and Mellonville would get bigger. But what they didn't know is Sanford had in mind that he wanted his own city, and he wanted his name to be cemented into history. And quickly, the city of Sanford developed as a separate town and overshadowed Mellonville and Fort Reed.